Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about sexual arousal and response, which is a continuation of the last couple chapters where we've been discussing really sensation and perception and how some of these processes work. And of course, we're always taking that biopsychosocial approach to sexuality. We did a couple chapters on male and female anatomy. Then we started delving into some of the biological processes associated with the brain. But again, here we need to start putting it all together because again we have these senses, and then when you stimulate these senses, it sends signals, through the neural pathways all along your body up to the brain, and then your brain sends signals back down to the body in this incredibly complex fashion. And so, again, when we're thinking about sexual arousal and response, again, what are we looking at? One, stimuli, and then our perception of that stimuli, and then how the stimuli and the perception of the stimuli create responses, whether it's social behavior, cognitions, emotions, feelings, whatever it might be that we're going to be discussing. So, yes, we have had to go deep into anatomy and biology, and we're looking at some of the brain structures. And of course, this is a little bit of a lower level class. So, as I've said, the real sensation and perception starts to kick in about the last, I think it's a 400 level class, so senior year level class for that. But again, so we're introducing you to a lot of these ideas that you'll get much deeper later on. And so I don't want to just bog you guys constantly with anatomy and trying to memorize all of these things, but we should be understanding how different parts of the brain, like the cortex versus the limbic system, are associated with different processes. And again, these chapters are starting to introduce some of these ideas. But to start out this lecture, the first heading is this brain and sexual arousal, exactly what's going on. And of course, I'm always taking this biopsychosocial approach. And then your book describes this process of the brain and sexual arousal as an interplay of social, emotional, cognitive processes, along with biological processes like hormones and brain neurons and spinal reflexes. Okay, the book even goes so far as to say that sexual arousal does not require physical stimulation. So, again, the stimuli can come from the body, but it can also come from the mind itself. And the book talks about things like fantasies, and that's the cortex of your brain. That abstract ability to do math and, picture things in your mind and all of this cool stuff, do great art that humans can do, fantasize, visualize. Those are our more recently evolved parts of our brain, the outer layers of our brain, okay? And so it's that part of our brain somehow can just imagine images, and that's enough to create physical responses and even have orgasms, for example. Hence, having an orgasm while you're sleeping, or having an orgasm when you're not being stimulated in some kind of a way, which is very possible. So again, sexual arousal does not require physical stimulation, but you can get sexual arousal from physical stimulation. Okay, so again, we need to be looking at the biological factors that are associated with experiencing stimuli and then sending signals to the brain, and then how the brain is a biological entity that sends signals to the body. Then we need to be looking at psychological factors like emotions and attraction and your perception of what is sexy or hot, or any of the words that you might want to use in a more casual way. And then you have to think about the cultural context. Again, how does the cultural context structure what we're attracted to, what we find attractive, things that we smell that are attractive, or things that we see that are attractive. Because again, what we might find attractive physically, biologically, may differ from a cultural representation of beauty, for example, things along those lines. And so the book does get into how culture structures sexuality. And the book has some specifics, and these are straight out of the book, but in the United States, for example, are uncircumcised penises a turnoff, whereas in other countries that's the norm, introduced by your book. Should orgasms be prolonged? In some countries, they do the kind of like the tantric sex where you postpone your orgasms and you enjoy foreplay and kind of teetering on the edge for longer periods of time. And in other cultures, it's much more quick and fast and straight to the orgasm. In some cultures, oral sex is acceptable, in some it's not. Orgasm rates by race. Your book got into, which women by race have experienced more sexual pleasure or more orgasms, and they found that there's a slight percentage disparity within races. um, then kissing on the mouth was also introduced by your book, because in some countries kissing is taboo, and in some, not countries, some cultures kissing is taboo, and in other cultures kissing is the norm. So again, with this class, hopefully I'm really beating into this idea of the biopsychosocial approach. What are the biological factors at play? All the body parts, all the neurons, the brain structure. What are the psychological processes? Not just, again, of course, neuroscience falls into these psychological processes, but, all those other kind of cognitive processes and these emotional processes and the things that get us thinking and feeling. And then the social context, like the culture, the social structure, even time, epic, because again, if you look at back across the decades, sexual norms change with time, for example. So we even consider the historical context. Um, for brain structures, a little bit of this is a repeat. Again, I think it's in week 2 that I got really deep into it, but your book just starts to point out that, these are the brain structures that tend to be involved. Okay, so it first starts highlighting the cerebral cortex, which is the outer parts of your brain. This is associated with those mental sexual events or your fantasies, for example, which I was just talking about. And then, okay, so again, I put a cut of the brain here so we can kind of look at this. So again, the cerebral cortex here, this is where all the lobes of the brain are, the outer part of the brain, okay? That is your higher level executive functioning. Then in the middle part of your brain here, you have the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus. And then these processes are also highly associated with, not only like emotion and motivation and things along those lines, but also sex drives, erections, ejaculation, sexual orientation. It's very complex. Um, and then you also have these neurons, the cells in your brain that release neurotransmitters. And so, again, all these neural pathways that go from your brain to your body, the entire nervous system, okay? And so they are neurons or cells line all of these processes. And when you stimulate the neurons, it releases neurotransmitters. Okay, and so neurotransmitters are just chemical messengers, is usually how they're described, that the brain and the nervous system use to communicate. The body has a separate form of chemical receivers. These are called hormones that are released into the bloodstream, and then that travels from the blood, in the blood, to the brain, seeps into the gray matter, and communicates that way. So again, your body has those two communicative systems that it uses. It's complex. Again, your body talks to your brain talks to your body. It's just what's going on all the time. But what's important is it's these neurotransmitters, these releasing of chemicals that, and the stimulating of neurons, and then our perception of the stimulating of those neurons that, really creates our entire reality. But that's also associated with like the way we feel, happiness, sadness, excitement, sexual desire. All of these things are really just neurotransmitters, like your feelings, your emotions. It's very complex. Even when you get into things like memory, memory is just cells that release neurotransmitters, and somehow with cells and neurotransmitters, we can memorize a bunch of stuff. It's all very complex and way beyond this scope of this lecture. But again, when we're looking at sensation and perception, we get sensations from a lot of things. Not only do you get those environmental stimuli, but again, your brain is stimulating itself by, neurons communicating with each other and releasing neurotransmitters. So again, it's very complex. But we get into a couple different types of neurotransmitters and roles that they might play. Like dopamine induces arousal and response. Testosterone releases dopamine, okay, which is then associated with your overall libido. So when your body releases testosterone, that instigates, neurons in your brain to release dopamine, which then increases your sexual activity. And so, counter to dopamine, serotonin does the opposite. Serotonin is released by the hypothalamus, which inhibits sexual activity. So, for males, after they have an ejaculation, for example, serotonin is released, and that's why the male sex drive drops directly after having an orgasm. And then the book also talks about how things like serotonin can be associated, like higher levels of serotonin can be associated with a reduced sex drive. So, for example, people that are taking serotonin reuptake drugs may report having a reduced sex drive. But again, it's because we're having these serotonin being kicked in and it's reducing the sex drive. And then, as we talked about last time, you have those subcortical structures like the limbic system, the middle of the brain that mediates behavior, pleasurable responses, and orgasms, the hypothalamus for sex drive, emotions, erections, ejaculation, sexual orientation, ansa lenticularis and the palladium for libido and sexual drive. Then again, you have these outer parts of your brain, the cortical structures like the frontal lobe, are associated with physical movements, arousal, control of sexual response, parietal lobes for arousal, genital sensation, temporal lobes for sexual orientation, sexual disorders, and paraphilias, and then the amygdala for sexual drive. And again, we're just getting at these are some of the brain processes that are involved in these. And again, our knowledge on this as scientists is not as extensive as you might think. Like we can, hook up an MRI and see all these processes going, but we can't trace all the neural signals. We can't map out every neuron in your brain. We don't have that kind of sensitive equipment. So again, it's a lot of this is brand new science, which makes it very interesting. But we're still trying to discover exactly what role all of these parts play. But as we talked about, it's the interplay of all of these processes of the body, a bunch of glands. You got parts of the brain, you got all these neurons and cells in the body, cells in the brain. It is absolutely complex how just the human body and brain works in the first place, let alone trying to explain all this behavior and sexuality on top of it. So then your book does, though, get into the senses and sexual arousal. So again, as I've explained many times now, you have these pockets of neurons or neurons that come out to your skin, for example, neurons attached to the retinas in your eyes, neurons and neural pathways attached to receptors in your nose, neurons and neural pathways attached to the tongue and the ears. You have hairs in your ears that when triggered they send signals to your brain to let you know what you're hearing. So again, hopefully you got some of that in your introduction to psychology class, or maybe you've gotten some of that in some of your other classes. But if you need a quick review of sensation and perception, that obviously helps with this, so you kind of understand all these processes. If you need to go a little bit deeper on it to understand it. But again, our skin, in most of the areas of our skin, in some areas more than others, like you have less neurons and nerves and neurons on your back than you do like on your fingertips, for example, or on your lips or your genitals or areas like that. And so realize that the skin doesn't have an evenly distributed amount of neurons. But you know when you stimulate neurons, when you stimulate your skin, as I've shown, scratch your hand or something like that, and you can feel that because it's stimulating the nerves, the neurons that are in these nerves, right? That sends signals to your brain to tell you that you're feeling something in your hand. And so again, that's how this is going to work for all of these processes. You get the stimuli, it triggers a neuron to release its action potential, which then releases neurotransmitters to communicate with the next neuron. Okay? And then all your neurons, a lot of them are primed for specific types of stimuli, which I'm not going to go again super deep into this. Let's get back to the sexual points. But when it comes to your touch, one of our senses, we have nerve endings. And so your book approaches this by looking at, for sexuality, these primary erogenous zones. Where are these areas of the body where you have high concentrations of nerve endings? And so again, you're going to find genitals, buttocks, anus, perineum, breasts, nipples, inner surfaces of thighs, armpits, navel, neck, ears, especially the lobes, and same thing with the breasts with the nipples. and mouth, specifically the lips, tongue, and oral cavity. Just because you have large pockets of nerve endings, not all stimuli in these areas is going to always be perceived as sexual pleasure. Again, hence that's the perception of what you're experiencing. And then that differs for lots of people. Like some people might enjoy a little nibbling or biting in certain areas. Other people might be like, please don't bite off my earlobe, you know? And so again, to each their own, and each culture might have these things, and so a lot of it's learned. And so again, that's the social context of like learning what actually excites you and what you like and what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with and things along those lines. But, again, these are good things to explore if you're, thinking about these kinds of things. It comes from a Grey's Anatomy episode, and the doctor in the Grey's Anatomy episode was saying there's actually 12 areas. Is that actually 12? I have to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So yeah, maybe these are all the areas that they were talking about on Grey's Anatomy that day. I mean, I was curious, like, what are those areas? Are the back of the knees really? But, armpits, that one shocked me. I remember watching that episode being like, armpits, really, Doctor from Meredith Gray's show? Armpits. But whatever, to each their own, okay? Okay, and then you have these secondary erogenous zones like all the other parts of your body. So imagine like somebody kissing you on your back, even though that's not necessarily the most like, something you would necessarily think about with like direct sexual activity or something like that. But does kissing in the back, can that be perceived as something that's stimulating, for example? But again, when we're looking at all of these, is we're looking at nerves and neurons. So again, all over our body, we have nerves, which within those you have all your neurons that send the signals from the body to the brain and the brain to the body. You have your vision. Again, the way the eyes work is, again, it's just light hits your eye, stimulates a bunch of neurons, it sends signals to your brain interprets these signals, and then puts a picture of what you're seeing in your head. So again, of course, your eyes are cueing you into the social context. But again, so much of what you're seeing is that for it to be sexually arousing, a lot of that is like, what have you learned and what are you naturally aroused with? So they've done experience with monkeys where like monkeys can pay to like look at pornography or like a elite female, like an alpha female, for example, and like they'll literally will pay to look at pornography of like, I mean, monkey pornography, hence the monkeys here. But that, that's very interesting that that is a thing. But it is. It's, how much of the human sexuality just overlaps with all the other animals on the planet. You have to think about things along those lines. So again, part of our vision, we are naturally, there's some evolutionary psychology arguments for this. Like, do we use our eyes to recognize beauty? Do we use our eyes, in mate selection? Do we use our eyes to decide whether somebody's a viable partner? And again, these are all, some interesting evolutionary biological arguments for, what we find attractive and is that associated with what we go after. So there's a lot to that. But then the other side of vision is, what do we culturally label as beautiful? What do we teach you? How do we socialize you? And that also structures your, the way you think about it. But then again, what are you actually attracted to? And if you take a psychological approach, when you're walking through the world, reflecting upon what you like and what you don't like, that's a big process too. Just observing and using your cognitions and asking yourself, how do you feel? And are you attracted to this thing? And are you aroused by this? So you have all these questions. Smell absolutely fascinates me. Like males, for example, can smell when a woman is menstruating. When I didn't know that until I was reading a psychology book one day and I was teaching, I think it was an intro to psychology class. It was in my intro to psychology class that I was teaching one day, a couple of years back. And I was like, did not know that. But again, why do males have that ability? Why, biologically, evolutionarily speaking, do our noses have specific receptors to know, and how much of that is just to like cue males into like that person is fertile and, etc. And so there's a lot of biological arguments as to how smell plays a role. But again, the book is very clear to point out that so much of smell is culturally conditioned. What are you used to? What types of foods are around? What's the body sense? What's the appropriate level of cleanliness? Things along those lines can all play a huge role. And so here your book starts to introduce pheromones, odors produced by the body that relate to reproductive functions. And so receptors in the nose are primed to receive pheromones. And so, as I was saying earlier, the neurons are primed to receive different types of stimuli. Like for color, you can see red, green, and blue. And you have three types of neurons to see color for your eyes. But again, you don't have neurons to see any other colors other than those wavelengths. And so you put all the colors that you see in the world just essentially consist of those three. When it comes to smell, it's more complex. We have hundreds of different types of receptors in our nose to smell all the different types of smells in the environment. And there's a lot of evolutionary reasons for why we developed that. And, but again, think about it. Like, you need to be able to smell food or things that are good or things that are bad to keep you safe, whatever it might be. There's some evolutionary reasons for why we need to be able to be cued into so many senses in the environment to increase our likelihood of survival. But again, we can smell it, okay? And so your book gets into it and it says, I put a question mark next to sexually because there is some hot debate on the subject, but the book says that your nose responds to I can't say these words, estrotetranol, which is estrogen contained in females' urine. So people that are attracted to females respond to that chemical in the air. And then people that are attracted to males respond to androstenedione, testosterone that's contained in men's sweat. And so our bodies are signaled to smell estrogen in females' urine and testosterone in men's sweat. And somehow this arouses sexual responses. And that's where I kind of put the question mark with sexually, because again, just something to think about, but this is what the book says. And then the book looked at differences in sexual orientation. And then it did like smell tests and said, what are you attracted to? What arouses you? And what you found is for heterosexual males, they're attracted to the scent of estrotetranol. Heterosexual females are attracted to androstenedione. Nah, 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 nah. But then what they found is gay males, for example, are attracted to the androstenedione. Again, the scent of men. And so again, how much of your sexual orientation is biological in nature, and that biology is so acute to specific types of senses, okay? Absolutely fascinating. And then same thing with taste, right? Like your book gets into tasting semen and tasting vaginal lubrications and whether that's appealing. And again, as some cultures are big on oral sex, some are not. Some people like that taste, maybe some others. So I mean, so much could be individual. And so there's a lot of debate here. And then, with hearing, again, your book starts talking about like communication and sweet talk. And I feel like the book wanted to talk about dirty talk a little bit. But again, that feeds into our fantasies. And then human interaction in general and social behavior. And so it's all very complex, of course. Then your book introduced aphrodisiacs and anaphrodisiacs. So you have the things that are supposed to increase sexuality and increase arousal and response. And then you have the things that decrease it. Check out this chapter, your book, or this section in the book. It goes pretty deep into all the different types of drugs and the effects of those. Some things that stimulate different things. Looked at alcohol and the effect of reducing inhibitions and how that's associated with sexual behavior. Introduced the idea of food, like throughout classical history, oysters and pomegranates and all these things in this pretty art picture were associated with it. And then it looks at anaphrodisiacs like opiates, things that reduce your sex drive, tranquilizers, anticoagulants, antihyperintensives, antidepressants, birth controls. There's an entire list. Just definitely go over that. I just, since for the sake of time, we won't go too deep. And then here we're also introducing hormones along with the pheromones and, the effective neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, hormones that influence sexuality, sensuality, and interpersonal attraction. These are these sex hormones called androgens and estrogens. Androgens are always considered the male sex hormone, and estrogens are considered the female sex hormone, even though we both create both, essentially. But you'll find that males make way more testosterone and females make way more estrogen, and these are some of those differences. So these sex hormones, they are called steroid hormones secreted by the gonadal glands, the testes, and the ovaries, and the adrenal glands. And so your book gets into how the testes produce 95% of androgens, and the adrenal glands make 5%. And the book says the ovaries and the adrenal glands make about similar amounts of estrogen. Both sexes produce both hormones, so don't assume that testosterone is only for males and estrogen only for females. It's not how it works. But again, males do make more testosterone and females more estrogen. The book gets into neuropeptide hormones produced by the brain and the hypothalamus that are associated with arousal, attraction, and response. And it really highlights oxytocin, this neuropeptide hormone associated with attraction and bonding. And your book keeps calling it the love hormone. This must go back to some silly science, but oxytocin is another one of those chemicals that are released, okay? These neurotransmitters that when that is released, it causes you to feel closely attracted to people. And that's that bonding that you feel. And the book even says that oxytocin is released with mother and child. It's not just a sexual thing. It can even just come from things like cuddling, for example. But through breast milk, oxytocin is contained. Why? Because again, it stimulates that mother bond. So evolutionarily, why do we release oxytocin through the process of sexuality or bonding? And it's because maybe biologically it wants you to bond and be social and interaction sexual behavior. Again, there's a reason that the body over millions of years and the brain have developed these neurotransmitters and hormones, right? I mean, so oxytocin boosts when oxytocin is released, this chemical is released, it boosts trust, eye gazing, empathy, mind reading, not mind actual mind reading, but like being able to theory of mind, put yourself in somebody else's shoes, positive relationship memories, partner communication, bonding cues, reduces stress and anxiety. And again, oxytocin is secreted not just with sexual activity, but again through breastfeeding, cuddling, physical intimacy. But yes, it does stimulate sexual activity. And then the release of oxytocin from the beginning to the end increases through that sexual excitement, from initial excitement to orgasm, and remains in the blood after bonding. And again, why is it remaining in the blood? And that's that kind of the after sex when you feel close with someone feeling that you might see in the movies or whatever, that's that oxytocin kicking in. It facilitates that sexual bonding. And I like my picture over here of with the sex hormones coming from the testes and the ovaries, and the oxytocin as these neurotransmitters being released, and just and then we have our lust and our attachment and our fun and I don't know. So the book does get into sexual response cycles, a couple different theories on that. But again, these are individual physical, emotional, and mental responses to sexual arousal. So you have Kaplan's three-stage model, which just says there's desire, then the excitement, then the orgasm. Bancroft and Jansen's dual control model is you have the excitatory processes and then inhibitory processes. And then Masters and Johnson's four-phase model of excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And you can kind of just mix these all mixed in. I like you have the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then to throw in Bancroft, some things you're going and you're all hot and heavy, and then all of a sudden something happens and you're like, oh no, stop, we gotta, that was awkward, or I think I can ask this person out. Never mind, I've been rejected, or you can mix that in a little bit. But this last model here that we have the picture of excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution is definitely a more standardized, right? You have your initial arousal, then you have just kind of enjoying it for a while, then you have your orgasm, and then you have that release of oxytocin where you cuddle and hang out in bed, for example. Sadly, the book gets into some sad finishes here, but as I get older, I have the three generations of women, from and I guess we'll talk about it. So, aging and the sexual response. On a bright side, you don't have to ever stop having sex. You can just have sex forever. There's nothing really stopping you. Of course, there are some physical processes that can stop you. However, maybe there's ways around that. But less and delayed vaginal lubrication over time, longer to obtain erections and maybe less firm over time, less pronounced orgasms for females and longer plateaus for men. And arguably the book says longer plateaus for men can be a little bit better because it avoids things like premature ejaculation and can maybe make some of the sex life better. Fewer contractions for females over time, less amount of ejaculation for men, and resolution occurs more quickly for both sexes in the end. The refractory period, just to sum this up, after sex, after orgasm, males need a little bit of time before this process can be kicked up. However, for women, they do not need a little bit of time. They can have multiple orgasms in a row. Interesting section in your book. Check that out. Hopefully you guys are getting just a kind of a feel that you have just this whole interplay between the body, the mind, and the social context. We haven't really gotten to the social context yet. Always in psychology, you really start out with these body processes. You always get in the biology of psychology and sensation and perceptions first. Then you start looking at the things like cognition. It's usually the middle of the book, and then it kind of finishes, with some of the social context issues. Even when we introduced gender issues last time, that gender issues chapter wasn't really focused on so much of the social context. It did introduce things like gender roles, but we haven't gone deep into like how gender influences sexuality, sexual behavior, sexual scripts. We've introduced it a little bit, but there's a lot more to talk about. So that's kind of how this book will go for the rest of the class. So I know we've been heavy on the biology side for a little bit, and so I appreciate your patience getting through the anatomy and physiology sections, getting through the sensation and perception sections. But again, all of this is incredibly important because we have to understand that body and mind interplay, and then how the social context influences all of that. Okay, because if we don't have a good grounding, how are we going to understand things going forward? So again, just as like kind of a recap, sexuality involves these physical responses, physical body parts, and also the structure of the brain. And then when we're looking at the psychological factors, we're looking at all of your cognitions, your thoughts, your emotions, motivations, your feelings, what's going on inside your head. And then we're going to be looking always heavily at culture and how that structures us, your experiences in the social context, things along those lines. So hope you guys have enjoyed these last couple lectures. That's just a good deep dive into the biopsychosocial approach to sexuality and learning as much as we can. I know there's a lot of words in here, and if you're not great with anatomy, you're not alone. Sensation and perception was probably the hardest class I ever took for my undergrad to get out of college. Wishing you all the best. Have a great day.